Hello, my name is Dr. Maggie Wenzel, and I am a bias researcher. I had the opportunity to do the latest iteration of my seminar on bias, on the neuroanatomy of bias, for a DEI group, or DEI council for a medical group, and it was called Bias in Healthcare and Making Impactful Change for Marginalized Communities. The seminar itself, I decided I wouldn't record the seminar because it was a closed session. It was a private group, and it was a small group, and we had the opportunity to share a lot of stories back and forth. I had the opportunity to share certain things from my personal life that I don't usually share with groups when I do this kind of a talk. And I feel like there were other members of the group who also were willing to share back, and I appreciated that, them putting themselves in my hands like that, and their vulnerability. And it was a really good session. I felt like it was a good opportunity for all of us to learn a little bit more of each other and have a more in-depth conversation that was at a more personal level. So I decided I wasn't going to make that original session available to the general public, but I did want to make a modified version of it available, and that is what I'm doing now. So Bias in Healthcare, Making Impactful Change for Marginalized Communities. Now, according to my research, and these are the 3 steps I've always talked about to mitigate bias, and it really has not changed through the years. I've been giving these sessions for about 5 years now, and the 3 steps that I first stated really still remain pretty much exactly as they were when I first started doing this. First of all, you have to agree that everyone is biased sometimes, a lot more than sometimes it turns out. The second stage here, the second step to mitigating your bias, is to listen to truth tellers in your life, if you have any, and to face up to your biases. And then thirdly, you want to learn and practice non-biased behaviors. The second step is the hardest one, but the first step is kind of the easiest. So usually we just start off the session by saying, repeat after me. Everyone is biased sometimes. Everyone is biased sometimes. And then we go a little more personal and we say, repeat after me. I am biased sometimes. I am biased sometimes. That's how it is. We're all biased sometimes. We all exhibit biased behaviors sometimes. And sometimes we get caught treating somebody in an unfair way, or favoring one person over another, for example. And that's when it starts to affect our workplace or our organizational structure. When we talk about everyone is biased sometimes, we start to look at the numbers in healthcare. Anecdotal stories are actually really helpful in this case because I think that opens up the public perception about the idea of bias in healthcare. But the reality is that when we want to talk about this in a scientific way, we do have to look at some peer-reviewed published studies, and so we actually quantify the bias in healthcare, and that is something that we can do at this point. That is something we can do. And there's a lot of information out there. So I had to focus in on basically one direction. I decided to focus on pain treatment because, I don't know, everybody has the right to live without pain within limits, as best we can. We try to mitigate people's pain, don't we? And it's a real problem when we don't mitigate somebody's pain for reasons of bias. One of the individuals who were in the seminar that I was presenting had brought up the idea that a person who has disabilities or differences in abilities may not be able to correctly articulate their pain level, or even if they do, they may not be believed. And so I thought, well, I'm going to slip some of that information into the final version of this talk. But I spent about an hour looking through studies, and I actually didn't find one. And that could be a weakness on my part, where I was not looking in the right places. And it could be that there just aren't a lot of studies out there about this. So we need to do better on that front as well. In the meantime, I would encourage people to share their anecdotes because that does, in the public perception means a lot. Like, the science does start to follow the public perception at some point. If enough people are interested in it, you will have people starting to look into those stories as well. Okay, so we start with sex differences in pain treatment. Here in this study, they were looking at gender disparities in analgesic treatment, pain treatment for ER patients with acute abdominal pain. Acute abdominal pain. So let's look at the numbers here. Women were less likely to receive analgesia. 60% of women received analgesia. 67% of men did. And then for opiates, there's always a big difference for opiates here. 45% of women received opiates. 56% of men received opiates for their acute abdominal pain. And I thought it was also, there's lots of interesting numbers here. I thought this one was particularly interesting. I don't really know what to make of it. The time it took to receive the medication was very different. For women, it took 65 minutes, over an hour, to receive analgesia in the first place. For men, 49 minutes. This was the median time. Less than an hour. Significantly less than an hour. I don't know how to explain it. This study actually talks about maybe some of the perceptions that are here, where healthcare practitioners may not be perceiving that women are in as much pain as men. So this was gender biases in estimation of others' pain. I did want to point out that one of the authors here, Elizabeth Lowson, is a researcher who looks at cultural plasticity. This is actually one of the last topics that we're going to be talking about in this seminar, so I wanted to point her out really quick. I really admire her work. So in this study, what they were doing was these healthcare practitioners were looking at photographs of people who were experiencing back pain or shoulder pain, and they were supposed to estimate the amount of pain based on a scale of 0 to 100, and then they sorted based on, severity of pain that the patients actually were experiencing. And they found that women were deflected downward and men were deflected upward, an average of 4 points, as you can see here. And it did not matter if the perceiver, the healthcare practitioner, was a woman or a man. And yes, these are all binary studies, by the way. I will be using men and women quite a bit today. There just is not a lot of studies that don't involve the binary of men versus women. We're going to see that a few times today. But yes, so the healthcare practitioner was either a woman or a man, and in either case, you can see that the disparity holds true and pretty stable. Women are downgraded and men are upgraded. So that may have to do with the idea that analgesia is not prescribed at the same level. We literally don't judge women's pain at as high of a level. All right, racial differences. So 3 studies here. For this one, we are looking at abdominal or back pain and analgesic treatment. And for this one, let's take a look here. This was non-whites versus whites. So 59% of non-whites received any analgesia, 66% of white patients. For opiates, 39% of non-white patients received opiates, 51% of white patients. And then again, in this study, we had a median time, the disparity, again, the time to give the analgesia in the first place was 98 minutes for non-whites and 90 minutes for white patients. Next, we have racial differences in pain treatment for extremity fractures in the emergency room. And this was black versus white. Black patients, 57% received analgesia, 74% of white patients received analgesia. So this was I think that these 2 last studies here talking about the white condition versus non-whites or white versus black, I believe might have something to do with what we see in this study. This is a pretty well-known study that came out in 2016. This was a sample of white doctors early in their careers. So either white medical students or white residents, and they were given a survey that asked about biological differences. And indeed, half of these people, half of these doctors actually thought that there was a biological difference. There were biological differences between black patients and white patients. So for example, they thought that black patients had thicker skin and they thought that Black people were less sensitive to pain. So that may explain some of the disparity that you see in the prescription of analgesics. And this paper also went into some of the history behind it. It turns out there's history that goes back, and it may or may not surprise you to know that a lot of these assumptions go back to slave times and even perhaps before then. It is kind of shocking that they still exist to this day. Again, this study came out in 2016. All right, so let's talk about the neurobiology of bias. Well, I am a neurobiologist. My research in grad school and then with working with students afterwards revolved around the idea of intracellular electrophysiology, where we were actually able to look inside of cells. We were able to impale actual cell bodies of neurons in intact brains and look at the way that neurons were interacting with each other. So we were able to establish neural networks in a physical construct. And then we were able to, for example, if you change the chemical composition of the brain, you could look at the behavioral outputs of that. So I come at these stories from a very structural perspective. Oftentimes when you hear scientists do bias research or bias talks when they do seminars on this, it's oftentimes a psychologist standing at the front of the room who is looking at psychological behaviors. They are looking at behavioral outputs. And sometimes the psychologist will mention parts of the brain. But I think that for whatever reason, maybe it's because that's not their specialty and they don't really want to get into the weeds of brain structures. Or maybe it's because it is kind of esoteric to talk about these things. But often the details of what happens inside of the brain during a biased response, well, they're not really discussed. And that is something where I feel like I bring something to the table, because actually I really like talking about the brain, and I really like thinking about how the brain works, how the human brain works. And I also like to make that information available to the public. I personally think there's a great deal of scientific curiosity out there. And in this day and age, in the age of information, where so much information is readily available to the general public, I think even a person who has never really formally studied science before may actually have a pretty significant level of scientific literacy. And so that is something that I kind of capitalize on, and I hope that I don't lose too many people when I get into the weeds of how the brain works. So here's the human brain. The half centimeter of gray matter that is most superficial in the human brain is called the cerebral cortex. And the cerebral cortex it coats the brain basically front to back, side to side. It dips into all these little sulci. It coats the gyri. It kind of dips down and coats everything underneath. It's the most superficial structure, the most external structure of the brain. And it's divided into three basic parts. Now, these three parts are involved in what we'd say is our highest level of cognition, our highest level of thought. So, for example, if you want to perceive a smell or a sound, or if you're looking at somebody's skin color, right? That information is going to be coming into the sensory cortex and will be perceived there. But flash forward, I'm going to be talking about this. I just want to put the idea in your head right now. Yes, the sensory cortex is where we perceive things at the highest level, and we'd like to think that these are always rational, conscious perceptions, but it actually is not. By the time that information hits the cortex, even at that first level when, smells are coming into the brain and sounds and visions are coming into the brain, even at that level, that first level of cognition, already you have that information is run through a filter. It's run through a bias filter already. And so you don't really perceive things properly and rationally. Well, I'll talk about that more. Okay, at the very front of the brain is the prefrontal cortex. This is our highest level of human thought, where we have rational thinking judgment, reason, and decision making happens in the prefrontal cortex when we're really focusing on something and thinking about it. We actually don't talk a lot about the prefrontal cortex because this is kind of, when we're really rationally thinking about things, we actually don't act in a biased way. But a lot of our decisions are not super conscious, and they're not the focus of our attention. A lot of things are actually mediated directly through the motor cortex. So this is the third part of our cerebral cortex, and it is the culprit. The motor cortex is often the place where a lot of our unconscious, biased behaviors actually stem from, because many of the things that you do in your day-to-day life are done automatically and unconsciously, and therefore they can be run through a filter of bias. So the motor cortex is our behavior center because the motor cortex, as the name suggests, is responsible for movement. So when you produce a movement, for example, when you speak words or when you write something in a chart, that is going to be stemming originally from the motor cortex. And believe it or not, these neural networks set up in here, they themselves can actually run the whole show for the most part. And I'm going to give an extreme example here, which is an unpleasant one. But if you are a police officer and you walk up next to a car, do you put your hand on your gun when you see that the person is a particular ethnicity? Is it possible that you walk up next to a car and you see that they are white people and you don't put your hand on your gun? But if you see that it is an African American man driving the car, you'll put your hand on your gun. That is a movement. That is a behavior. And sometimes it leads to tragic results, of course, as we know. But that is the sort of thing that comes from the motor cortex, where we're doing stuff maybe without even thinking about it. And it's a really extreme example, but in our day-to-day lives, we're doing this stuff all the time. All right, lastly, we're going to be diving into the brain, into the limbic system. This is not part of the cerebral cortex, but is a different set of structures kind of deep within the brain. And we start off with the amygdala, and we're going to be spending some time on the amygdala. I did write down here that the amygdala is the fear center, and that is true. About 99% of your fear responses do come from the amygdala, but I do want to emphasize that it doesn't have to be this way. The amygdala is really much more an alertness system. We say, look at that over there, look at that face over there. And yes, sometimes we see the face and we're scared of it. That's possible. That's one possible outcome. Or we set a little bit of alarm out to the rest of the brain. But it doesn't have to be that way. It can just be alertness. So we have our fear center, and then we have our reward system. The ventral tegmental area, the VTA, the nucleus accumbens up here in the striatum. Between them, they have what we call the mesolimbic pathway. Now, this pathway is responsible for our feeling of reward. So there's a dopaminergic pathway from the VTA to the nucleus accumbens. Okay, so there's two basic emotions that you experience in your brain, fear and reward, and that's actually it. These are the only two emotional structures, really, other than other structures that might be associated with them or that might input into them or receive input from them. So you only experience fear and reward. You don't really experience any other emotions other than basically derivatives of these two emotions. So you might feel sad about something or guilty, or you might feel joyous, or you might feel great pleasure. All of these things come from the experience of fear and or reward. When you dislike something, your amygdala will light up. When you like something, your VTA and your nucleus accumbens will light up. So we like to think that our decisions and our behaviors all come from the cortex, but it turns out that a lot of our information comes directly from the limbic system and that our cortex is heavily influenced. For example, I did a deep dive into the auditory cortex because I was interested in sound perception. And let's put it this way. The way that you hear people's voices, for example, will be different depending on what the source is. So for example, if there is a person standing at the front of the room who has a deep voice, they are telling you some information. You're at your job now. This is a new person. You don't know them, but I don't know. You kind of just feel like they know what they're talking about. They seem like a leader. Big part of that may actually have to do with the fact that they have a deep voice. We associate deep voices with leadership, and that probably comes from the idea that both the VTA and the nucleus accumbens, these reward systems in your brain, both of them send impulses into the auditory cortex to say, we like this, and importantly, they get the information first. The VTA and the nucleus accumbens will light up 30 milliseconds after a sound comes into the brain. 30 milliseconds is an incredibly short period of time. The auditory cortex will perceive that sound at about 500 milliseconds, a full half second. That's a much, it's more than 10 times as long a time period. So the nucleus accumbens of the VTA get to the sound first and they say, we like it. And then they send an amplification of the idea that we like that sound into the auditory cortex, so that by the time the auditory cortex perceives that sound, you've already decided, I like this guy. He's a good leader. Let's look at the other side of the story. Guess what? Our friend, the amygdala, our fear center here, also has the ability to send impulses into the auditory cortex. And you might associate this, for example, with a woman standing at the front of the room. I think it's fairly well established that we trust lower voices more. You hear and see women struggling to lower their voice, lower their pitch, because they have been told that the public trusts leaders who have deeper voices. So they struggle with actually having a higher range feminine voice, and they will actually try to deepen their voice in order to seem more leader-like. So women will actually lower their voices in order to be taken more seriously as a leader. Why? Because it turns out that the amygdala, again, it's just the same story. The amygdala will experience a sound at 30 milliseconds, very short time frame. Will say, I don't like it, and will actually send an impulse into the auditory cortex and amplify the feeling of dislike. So before you have the conscious perception of the sound, you've already had the emotional reaction to the sound. Let's take a look at this study here. Again, we're looking at the amygdala. In this study, they took 13 white people who self-described as not being racist. They perceived themselves at a conscious level as not being racist. That's actually important. It is important to have a conscious understanding of yourself as not being racist. However, their unconscious brains told a different story. So let's take a look at this. What they did was they flashed faces, either a black face or a white face, and then they did an fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging study of these people's brains, and then they saw how much the amygdala actually lit up. So you can see right away, of course, with the black faces, you'll see a higher lighting up. This is unconscious. This is at the basic level. This is implicit bias. This is the neural basis of implicit or unconscious bias, isn't it? The amygdala lights up much more for a black face than it does for a white face. Okay, but when we flash the face for only 30 milliseconds, well, that's a very short time period. That's actually not enough time for most people to even have seen that there was a face. They would have no conscious understanding that they saw a face. But the amygdala saw it, if you will. The amygdala experienced that face because 30 milliseconds is enough time for that unconscious emotional center to understand that stimulus. So when we see the black face here flashing, we'll see a huge lighting up, a huge activation of the amygdala at the 30 millisecond time point, and less so though at the 525 millisecond time point, which was enough time for you to have a conscious perception of the face. So yes, No matter how you identify at a conscious level, at an unconscious level, you may have some biases going on. You may be a little racist at an unconscious level, even if you don't perceive yourself that way. And I think that's important to understand. Now, the amygdala does not have to be, as I said earlier, the amygdala doesn't have to be the fear center. What we're looking at in this study is basically the normal activation of the amygdala. This is the basolateral amygdala here, looking at specific interneurons that are responsible for some of the fear response. But you can see that they're not always having an understanding of fear. Sometimes they are what we call tonically depolarizing. They're having these tonic spikes. But when we put a stress on them, this CNO here, it's kind of hard to explain exactly what's happening in this study, but basically you can look at this as being the protein correlate of stress. So this person was experiencing a stress response, and when you see that stress response start to hit the basolateral amygdala, you could start to see phasic bursts. And these phasic bursts are what the researchers called, as they said, it facilitates fear memory recall and facilitates a conditioned expression of fear. So this is the amygdala when it's naturally sort of just in its element, hanging out, observing faces, doing its thing, paying attention to things. And then this is a conditioned expression of fear. So you can see at a cellular level again that the amygdala can be one thing or another. It doesn't have to be, just because the amygdala is activated does not mean that it's going to exhibit a fear response. But of course, it could be said that the more activated it is, the closer it comes to a fear response. Now, the reason I say that it's important for you to understand about your amygdala, even if at a conscious level you identify as non-biased, at an unconscious level, you have to understand you have some other experiences, maybe based on things that you've experienced throughout your lifetime or a culture that you were raised in, for example. It's important to actually understand those things because you can consciously control your emotions. And I think that we all kind of know that anyway, but let's look at how this looks at a cellular level. So this was a study that came out in 2017. I really like this study. This was a review actually of hundreds of papers where they were trying to figure out exactly how the emotional center interacted with the prefrontal cortex and other levels of brain structures. Now, number 3 right here, that is the amygdala. And you can see that the amygdala does have an outsized network with all kinds of different parts of the brain, that is for sure. But look, the arrows are bidirectional. It's not just the amygdala shooting information out. You can also feed back into the amygdala, basically to say, okay, all is clear, no need for fear response. I guess that's the way that I'm explaining it. The amygdala can be many things. It can be a fear center, but it can also be controlled. It can be controlled by the rest of the brain, I think. Now we come to the second stage of our 3 steps in order to mitigate your own biased response. This is the hardest one. This is a painful step. Once you've gone through step 1 and you've admitted that everybody has biases, sometimes for some reason in the moment, it's actually quite difficult to face up to your own biases. It's very likely that if somebody confronts you and says that you've been biased or exhibited some biased behaviors, that you will become defensive or try to make excuses for it. But it's best just to face up to that because that's going to be the fastest way to actually start to look into your own biases and start to fix them, honestly. So listen to truth tellers in your life and face up to your own biases in the moment. Well, let me talk about some of the incidents, some of the more recent incidents that have come to my attention. In my TED Talk, I discussed how a student called me out on my sexism in a certain classroom policy. There's another seminar that I gave. I believe I mentioned this in another seminar that a student called me out because I was not giving any attention to women of color. This was a class where I was talking about the history of science and how women had more of a role than they were given credit for, and I gave all these examples, and I never gave examples of women of color. I only gave examples of white women, and this was the very end of the semester, and I couldn't do anything about it. But of course I made the commitment that if I were to ever teach that class again, that I would make sure that I was also giving examples of women of color. And now I've found all those examples, and so I'm ready. Okay, so about a year ago, some colleagues and I had an abortion panel where we were talking about the Supreme Court decision of Dodds v. Jackson Women's Health Center. It was the Supreme Court decision, the United States Supreme Court decision that basically overturned Roe v. Wade. And because there was a lot of public outcry at the time and there was a lot of confusion, there were 5 women professors at my school who got up and made a panel of where we discussed our views on this, and we all took turns with the microphone. I thought it was a very respectful conversation. We did not all agree on all points, but it really was a good conversation, in my opinion. Well, at the end of this, there were, I would say, several hundred people in attendance, including lots of students, faculty, administration. It was well attended. And the Q&A was very good. We had plenty of time, and lots of people stood up and asked questions and asked for clarity. And one student stood up and said, well, I noticed that you all talked about pregnant women, but none of you talked about people who don't identify as women but are pregnant. And I thought that was really kind of a sad oversight on all of our parts. I hope that all of us took that back, took that feedback and moved forward, determined to use the term pregnant people whenever it was appropriate. Of course, it's not common to have somebody who does not identify as a woman who also finds themselves pregnant, but that is also all the more reason to make sure that we are including them. Just because it's a rare case doesn't mean that they don't also need attention. So pregnant, it doesn't cost us anything to say pregnant people instead of pregnant women. So we can change that vocabulary. And you'll notice that there's a lot of people in the media who now say pregnant people instead of, pregnant mothers or pregnant women. I have erroneously used in interesting language instead of the correct word intersex in the past. And this is one that I've actually noticed in myself. Nobody has ever reported it to me, but I've noticed that I spend more time with students who are close to me physically. So we have a lab space, for example, and my desk is in one corner. And then there is a lab group. There are 6 lab groups around the room. One lab group is really, really close to my desk, right on top of it. And I find that I spend a lot of my time casually having discussions with those students who are at that closest desk. Well, that means that they have, my grading system is not subjective. It is almost entirely objective. So it doesn't really make a difference to the grade per se. But it does mean that those students will feel more comfortable asking me questions or clarifications, or just having that ability to chit-chat with me about their weekend or something like that. I think that gives them a huge advantage. Nobody has ever complained about it, but I feel it's very apparent, and the disparity is significant enough that I have taken steps to overcome that. So you can look for things in your own life. Nobody has to be telling you. You can look for things. You can look around and find things in your own life. You want to look around for areas where you are privileged. This may be very, very difficult if you are at the first steps of trying to figure out your own biases. Your level of privilege is basically invisible to you. Anybody who doesn't have that privilege will easily be able to see your privilege, but you will have a hard time seeing it yourself. So you want to think about ways that you are automatically privileged, perhaps the color of your skin, perhaps your sex, perhaps your physical attractiveness, or your education level may give you an advantage over other people. And you do have to take that into account when you're talking with people and when you're making leadership decisions, for example. Well, here's my suggestion. If you're really not sure, how your privilege is affecting you or where you're being biased, I would suggest removing all emotions from situations as much as possible. Try not to lean on, I like this or I don't like this at the start. You really want to make sure that you're taking emotions out of your decision making as much as possible. You want to be careful how you identify. This is one that's kind of interesting because I think the more you lean into an identity as, for example, well, I am a person who is an adherent to social justice issues. I pay attention. I make sure that I use the correct vocabulary. If you are somebody who identifies that way, it's going to be even harder for you to overcome your biases, in my opinion, because your conscious identity will be getting in the way. Like, you'll be fighting yourself to say, I couldn't possibly be treating somebody in an unfair way. Look at all the things that I do. Look at all the charities that I volunteer at, for example. I don't know. But if you are a person who consciously is always, sharing posts on social media that show how very conscious you are of equity issues, then it's going to be even harder for you to recognize your own biases. So be very aware of that, especially if that describes you. And lastly, I think that it's really important to look at numbers. I can't believe what seems to be very, very obvious ways that biases come through, like salary disparities, for example, or I don't know, the number of people in leadership who are all white men. When you look at a company, it still has all white men at the top. Something's wrong. You could just start to count things and start to see differences where there shouldn't be differences. So I don't really know what more to say about that at this moment, except look at your numbers and you may find some disparities there and you should fix them as much as you can. Now, lastly, if you have made it through the first steps and you have admitted that everyone is biased sometimes, and maybe you've admitted to some of your own biases, or you're starting to see some of your levels of privilege, you're starting to look around at that stuff, or you're starting to believe people when they tell you you're being biased, for example. The third step is to learn and practice non-biased behaviors. I think it's possible that you could skip straight to step 3, even if you do not adhere completely to step 2. If you didn't understand anything about yourself, I think you could still make a difference by learning and practicing non-biased behaviors. So we're going to start off, as is the theme of this seminar, with bias in healthcare. So I'm going to say something that I know a lot of people don't really like to hear, and I may get pushback on this depending on how many people view this video. Statistically speaking, women are better physicians. Women are better. There's better outcomes. There's lots of data behind this. I mean, when you look at numbers here, it's hard to hide from the truth. The outcomes are better. The amount of time spent with patients is greater. I didn't actually dive into that story. I think I might actually do another video on that story because I do want to dive into that and really tell a good story about that. But I will say that some of the neurobiology is already here. So this is a study that shows the amount of reward that people experience when they are either doing pro-social behavior, which means community-oriented behavior, taking care of other people, for example, or when they are doing selfish behavior. So, all right. So here we are looking at the lighting up of the striatum. Here it is, striatum activation. And the striatum is the locus for that nucleus accumbens we discussed earlier, which is part of your mesolimbic pathway. It is part of your reward system. So how much does the reward system light up when you are engaging with pro-social choices? Well, for women, and again, I know this is binary here, women versus men, but here we are. For women, the striatum, the reward system will light up more when engaging in pro-social behavior, and quite the opposite story for men. Their reward system will activate less when they're engaging in pro-social behavior, and that actually has to do with here. The percentage of pro-social choices, this was a game where they were either keeping money or giving money away. Pro-social choices for women, these choices are much greater unless their reward system is depressed and blocked. And in that case, a lot of those pro-social choices actually go away. For men, it's the opposite story. When the reward system is blocked, their pro-social choices actually increase, because if their reward system is not blocked, in other words, where they're feeling the lighting up of the reward system, they will actually make more selfish choices. So in a general sense, I think what I've seen feedback sometimes from male physicians on this kind of study, the feedback that I've seen are things like, well, should I just stop practicing medicine then? Am I just a terrible doctor? Well, first of all, this is just statistics. There's always going to be exceptions in either direction. There are certainly women who are questionable doctors, and there are men who are exceptional doctors. Of course, this is just statistics. We're looking at, groups by, that's how numbers are going to work, of course. But it's also to say that if men can be aware of these kind of where maybe they're not getting as much reward, maybe they should just be aware of that and make different choices, even if it doesn't specifically give them that ping of reward to, I mean, it's terrible to say that they wouldn't feel a ping of reward when they're helping somebody else, because of course they would, but maybe they should just be aware of the disparity there in their own brains of where their selfish choices versus pro-social choices, maybe they won't naturally feel that at all times. Well, let's look qualitatively at what women are doing right, statistically speaking. Statistically speaking, there's always exceptions, okay? There's always exceptions. But generally speaking, it is thought that women are better at listening to patients and paying attention to the actual patient experience and the whole patient experience. It is thought that women respond better to constructive feedback during the training period, especially when they are, for example, learning how to perform a particular procedure. They are more likely to change the way that they're doing things if they're given constructive feedback. And then thirdly, and we're going to focus in on this one, protocols. Women doctors are actually more likely to stick to protocols. Anecdotally, that is true. I will say, just at a personal level, during the pandemic, I saw a lot of male doctors. Unfortunately, we did have to go to see a lot of different kinds of doctors during the pandemic because of different medical issues we had in the family. And when I saw somebody just blatantly foregoing any kind of protocols with regard to the pandemic, it was always a male doctor. Okay, so that's my anecdote there. That's as far as I will go. But so anecdotally, you do hear about these kind of things where male doctors are less likely to use protocols. But protocols are important. Let's look at the numbers. From 2006 to 2013, the state of California made a conscientious effort to try to lessen maternal death rate, and they were successful. The maternal death rate during this time period fell by 55%, simply by using protocols. They had checklists, carts, drills, and teamwork. For example, in maternal deaths, which are still far higher than they should be given the state of advanced healthcare that we have now, 27% of maternal deaths, a quarter of maternal deaths, come about because of a hemorrhaging event or a bleeding out event. In half of those cases, the bleeding out was not detected. So one of the things that these protocols specifically do is they measure the specific blood loss. They put a number on it. Remember numbers. So whenever a gauze is removed to remove some blood, the gauze pad goes right on a scale. And as the gauze pads that are soaked with blood start to stack up on this scale, you can actually see the amount of blood loss. You can weigh the amount of blood loss. And when that blood loss is at a certain level, you have to start saying, that is a lot of blood loss. It's no longer an opinion. It's no longer based on this person's nonverbal. This person is of, as a Black woman, and I don't think that she's really experiencing that much pain. You know, there should be no opinions here. It's just numbers. We say that's a lot of blood loss. It looks like this person is hemorrhaging. We need to take these steps to mitigate the blood loss. So that's how it's done. Protocols. Protocols. And this is something that you're probably going to be seeing more and more. This is actually implemented already in some hospital systems, where in this case, this was a hypothetical situation where a Black woman named Molly had told the medical technician that her pain level was 7 out of 10. When the physician started examining the patient, they never asked about the pain levels, and they began to close out the chart. But before they closed out, the computer flashed a screen that said, "Have you checked? Studies show that Black women are significantly less likely to have their pain addressed. Are you sure you do not want to address Molly's pain?" So of course, at that point, you would go back and say, "Oh, I see here, it's written here that your pain level is 7 out of 10. What's wrong? What do you want to talk about today? What do you have to share?" And I thought this was the more simple one that I've actually seen. It was pretty straightforward and easy to recognize, but I've seen other examples of this that are actually being implemented that specifically show, like, in this hospital system, this is the amount of prescription drug that we give to white men versus Black men. Are you sure this is the dosage that you want to use? So it just keeps everybody aware that by and large, in the community, there are not that you're exhibiting bias in that moment, but in the community, we sometimes are a little bit biased. Are you sure you might not want to up this person's drug dose, for example? All right, so what can you do? In our normal day-to-day lives, if you are not actually in a medical facility, there's still plenty that you can do to mitigate mitigate your bias responses. So most of the actions that you can take in a day-to-day, for example, you're at your job, most of the things that you can do are not really that dramatic, but they are banal. They are just day-to-day choices that you can make to make sure everybody feels more equal. I think that is a really good start in a workplace or in an organizational structure to make sure that we are giving some kind of fluidity to the workplace and allowing for differences, actually. So high frequency things that can be done every single day. First of all, you can travel, you can do volunteer work, you can go to different parts of the city and walk around maybe. I'm really big on making sure agendas are fair. I think that if you make sure that, for example, somebody who usually doesn't have a voice speaks earlier in a meeting, I think that's a really good idea, because toward the end of meetings, I think meetings kind of tend to, they kind of run together. Oftentimes they're running a little bit behind, so those last few things on the agenda are not really addressed properly. So that's something to consider. You want to encourage new voices at meetings, expect that maybe they won't have the most confidence at first, and that they may have different types of ways of speaking, and that's okay too. You cannot expect everyone to have that super smooth, professional, all the buzzwords in the vocabulary immediately, especially if they've never spoken at a meeting before. It's definitely not going to be that conscientiously high-level vocabulary right away. This here, take notes and do low visibility work. I really am directing this specifically at men. What I have seen, at least in academia, is that women tend to take on the yeoman's work on committees. They tend to be the ones to take minutes. If there is an upcoming event and a caterer needs to be contacted, then it's going to be a woman doing that work. So I would recommend for men, especially men in senior positions, especially men who are maybe white, cis-het, Christian, able-bodied, high-level, if they take on those tasks and actually do them well, that actually would go a really long way to changing the culture in that committee and maybe in the whole workplace, believe it or not. That would be quite significant. So women stop doing that work and men start taking it on. Meet with new people, stop by the desks of people you don't normally stop by, bring new people into your committee. Now, if you've taken these kind of high frequency daily steps to make sure that you are interacting in new ways with new people, then in these low frequency, high impact situations, such as hiring a new person in leadership, promoting a new person into leadership, it's much more likely that you're going to make a less biased decision about doing that if you have done the work at the high frequency daily level of making sure that by and large everyone feels heard, everyone feels more equity in the workplace. Now this has to do somewhat like with this experiment here. So this was published last year, and the basic idea here, it was a psychological experiment with lots and lots of trials. There was lots of findings out of this one. But the basic gist of it, if I'm explaining it correctly, is that incidental exposure is actually really important for learning more about somebody that you don't know very much about, or something that you don't know very much about. It's the daily work of, having your cubicle right next to somebody of a different ethnic background, for example, or meeting for coffee with somebody that you normally wouldn't have met with, somebody from that background, for example. That kind of incidental exposure is going to give you more information and more ability to actually learn more about that culture and more open-mindedness, if you will, than, for example, having somebody in a seminar once a year talking to you about diversity issues. Of course, you should bring in lots of speakers, of course, into your workplace, but also just having more equity, having more inclusivity on a daily basis is actually going to do wonders for your own ability to take on diverse issues. So this has to do with cultural plasticity. We want to have more interactions with people that are less emotional, they're more positively emotional or just neutral emotion. The more women you see in leadership, the more you will recognize that women are capable of leadership. There's many policies that used to be kind of just part of our culture that are no longer there. Have you ever heard of cloverture? I mean, that's not a thing anymore. Because it's horrifying now to think that we could just take a woman's credit to say women are not allowed to have bank accounts or women are not allowed to have credit cards. Like, she can use her husband's credit card. Well, these days that is completely out of the question. There's no way. But there's also things happening today that we need to improve upon so that in 20 years, 40 years, 60 years, they will look back and say, that's ridiculous. Why would they do that? We need to work on our cultures, and we need to work on our cultural experiences and make sure that we are cleaning up some of these biases that exist on a day-to-day basis. All right, so this is some information about cultural plasticity here. I'm discussing mirroring behavior here. This has to do with what I was just discussing. The idea is that if you have more and more things going on around you that are culturally representative of something outside of your own demographic background, then you're going to experience those things in the sensory region of your brain. You will eventually perceive that information and store that information, and eventually you will take on some of those experiences yourself. You will start acting in a similar way. That is called mirroring behavior. And then in a similar way, I would say, cross-modal plasticity works similarly, where if you, for example, hear a piece of music and you are a musician, the part of your motor cortex that is responsible for you playing your instrument will start to light up just by hearing that piece of music. So remember, the sensory cortex takes in information, but the motor cortex is responsible for creating behaviors. So when you take in more information from the outside world that is diverse, your motor cortex will start to act more diverse as well. This is the basis behind cultural plasticity. You fill up your sensory cortex, you take in information about diverse things and equitable practices, then you will start to behave in that way as well. Well, that comes to the end of my seminar. It was a great pleasure to work with this group. I was very pleased to work with this DEI group and talk about some of my findings, and I'm hoping that the experience was as fulfilling and rewarding for them as it was for me. I'm recording.